So yeah, I've been doing research on memory and heritage in Senegal for way too long. And in the meantime, so while I was writing this up and trying to finalize the book that is meant to come out of this, I got a little distracted. You want me to move here? I got a little distracted by this notion of the archive. So I read Derrida's mysterious book, Archive Fever, and got quite intrigued by it. I don't think I got my head quite around it, but I started applying the notion of archive to my research, and so I'm trying to see to what extent heritage can be understood in terms of the archive. So that's partly what I'm trying here in this paper. Archives are utopias. In their totalizing telos, they incorporate the scopic regime of the panopticon. Invented to regulate life in perfection, archives resemble the utopian city in their will to order. This analogy between cities and archives was observed by de Certeau, who analyzed the utopian city as a space produced by a panoptical view, and famously opposed to this view his theory of spatial practices as a, quote, chorus of idle footsteps, unquote. Against the strategic planning of Haussmann's boulevards in Paris, de Certeau embraced the practical tactics of everyday life. This paper draws upon de Certeau's analogy between cities and archives, and his distinction between strategies and tactics, in order to analyze how the city of Saint-Louis in Senegal consigns sites to the archive, and by privileging some spaces over others, promotes particular memories. So I'm going to give you my first scopic view of Saint-Louis, the last one as well, I guess. Well, I think what you should know is that the islands on in the Senegal River is what the original site of Saint-Louis was. This is a peninsula that runs for about 20 kilometers alongside the Senegal River. And the Senegal River then flows into the Atlantic. That's the African mainland. So the site of Saint-Louis, this island was well, a comptoir and developed into the capital of French West Africa. What we witness in Saint-Louis are parallel processes of archiving that are profoundly entangled in the very space of the city. Whilst UNESCO archives Saint-Louis as a colonial city, the disciples of the Sufi saint Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba document the traces of his anti-colonial resistance in the same urban space. Following de Certeau, I want to examine how local legends of the city's hidden spaces are incorporated into the tactical archive of the Sufi saint. Engaging with current ideas and debates on the archive, I try to conceptualize how we should conceive of the city as archive. And the connection to this particular seminar is that I want to recover a silenced subaltern subject and examine the post-colonial reclamation of an affective geography of colonialism. So Saint-Louis was founded in 1659 as a fortified comptoir. The original establishment of Saint-Louis was on the island in the Senegal River, and it served as an entrepot in the transatlantic trade, which is not very much advertised in Senegal. As you all know, that Gorée Island instead is being profiled as the site for the transatlantic slave trade. With the suppression of the slave trade and the boom in the legitimate trade, the post was increasingly conceived of as a colony. The spatial logic of the trade post prevailed throughout much of the 17th and 18th century, and then gave way to a military logic when Saint-Louis became the capital of the Senegalese colony. In 1828, an urban plan was adopted, and the central fortress was turned in the Hôtel du Gouverneur, today known as the Governor's Palace, which is this central building. The accommodation of an increasingly large number of military personnel constituted a major problem for the army at the time. And whilst the African soldiers were relegated to the town's periphery, 2 military barracks were erected in the center to accommodate the French soldiers. And this is one of those barracks. There was another one at this site. Built in front of the governor's palace, these 2-story barracks faced each other and formed a square in the center of town. With the presence of French ships that signaled the city's connection with the metropole, the center of colonial power functioned as a model city with the purpose of civilizing the African subjects. With French flags waving from the governor's palace, a wide vista of French presence was created. Facilitating traffic across the island, the square also functioned as a traffic hub that linked the northern and southern sides of the island, and it still functions that way today. Founded on the spatial logic of the military, the Place de la Savane, as it was called at the time, offered a true spectacle of modernity. And with the establishment of the iron bridge of the Pont Faidherbe, or the Bridge Faidherbe, across the Senegal River in 1897, the square also functioned as an east-west axis connecting the city to the continent. That's a contemporary postcard, as you can tell. Described as a unique city in the world, Saint-Louis was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2000. On UNESCO's website, a brief description of the city outlines its unique characteristics, and I quote, "Founded as a French colonial settlement in the 17th century, Saint-Louis was urbanized in the mid-19th century. It was the capital of Senegal from 1872 to 1957 and played an important cultural and economic role in the whole of West Africa. The location of the town on an island at the mouth of the Senegal River, its regular town plan, the system of quays, and its characteristic colonial architecture give Saint-Louis its distinctive appearance and identity." Unquote. The area selected for the UNESCO nomination is confined to the island and the bridge Faidherbe. Beyond that, the river-facing parts of the Langue de Barbarie, the peninsula, and the mainland are also included in the nomination as buffer zones subject to different conservation regulations. In its zoning, the patrimonialization of Saint-Louis echoes the urban planning of the 19th century. Whilst there is no doubt that the nominated cityscape, quote, "illustrates the development of colonial government in this region," unquote, one might ask to what extent the patrimonialization of the island privileges a particular politics of memory. The rectangular street plan and the buildings that still remain intact were both established in the late 19th century and replaced the Creole comptoir that preceded it. What is thus preserved is the colonial city to the detriment of older strata of the city associated with the slave trade. The process of patrimonialization also excludes those native neighborhoods that were already firmly established by the late 19th century, but whose inhabitants were denied the rights of French citizenship that the inhabitants of the island enjoyed. Moreover, the decay of certain forms of architecture has had an impact on what can still be preserved. While the one and two story houses of the privileged inhabitants, as on the left, have remained, the straw huts that housed their domestic slaves have long since disappeared and can therefore not be preserved. Thus the city's archiving is highly selective and exclusive. On top of that, at various occasions, the technical process of the city's conservation has run into considerable trouble. The site's transfer to the list of endangered heritage was imminent on several occasions. The reasons why the conservation of Saint Louis' cityscape was almost declared endangered are many and diverse. Apart from the political, bureaucratic, and technical obstacles to the successful conservation, the population of Saint Louis itself does not seem to appreciate the city's patrimoine in the same terms as defined by the UNESCO nomination file. So to improve the population's understanding of its architectural heritage, the city's Bureau de Patrimoine has trained instructors to provide sensibilisation, training into a proper appreciation of cultural heritage. Even though such pedagogic programs will generate more awareness of the conservation plan, it is questionable whether they will change the inhabitants' feelings towards the colonial legacy. It is remarkable, for instance, to what extent the interpretation of the heritage is directed towards tourists. In the way Saint Louis is preserved and presented to tourists, colonial nostalgia often prevails. Explanatory panels of a tourist parcours give historical details about the historical buildings on the island in a seemingly objective way. But the French tourists, who constitute the bulk of foreign tourists visiting Saint Louis, are not encouraged to think about the colonial legacy from the point of view of the colonized. These tourists tend to see the colonial city as an architectural legacy that is neglected, and to their minds, Africans cannot be trusted with the legacy of the mission civilisatrice, or civilizing mission. In a recent issue of the glossy magazine produced for the passengers of Senegal Airlines, an article on Saint Louis presented its conservation policy thus, quote, "A UNESCO World Heritage Site, the former capital of French West Africa, looks forward to one day returning to the splendor of times gone by." Unquote. So that's my resume of the conservation policy of the cityscape as it is supported by UNESCO. And I will now switch to the alternative archive that I'll be looking at for the rest of the paper. In 1895, the year in which Sheikh Amadou Bamba was summoned by the colonial authorities, the French army had almost completed its conquest of Senegal, but still feared revolts led by Muslim leaders. Bamba had just established the Tariqa, the path of the Muridiyya, the first Sufi brotherhood founded by a black African. I'm not entirely sure about this claim. Let's say the first Sufi brotherhood established in this part of West Africa. In a context in which many Senegalese converted to Islam and became disciples of Bamba, fear of an uprising led the colonial government to summon him to stand before the Privy Council in Saint Louis. This trial is not well documented, yet among historians of the Muslim Brotherhood, it is agreed that its outcome was known from the start. Bamba was indeed found guilty of the allegations and condemned to 7 years of exile in Gabon. Since the 1970s, pilgrims flocked to the center of the former colonial empire, Saint-Louis, to remember a prayer allegedly recited by Bamba in defiance of the Privy Council that condemned him to exile. But what exactly is commemorated by the Mourides on the 5th of September? During one of my visits to Saint-Louis, a few days before the commemoration, I met Tafa Sek, a Mouride and former school teacher, who then made a living as a painter, selling his paintings on the pavement of the square Ferdinand, the central square of Saint-Louis. As soon as I made inquiries about the paintings, he recounted his version of what had happened in 1895, assuring me that he had conducted extensive research. Quote, Senegal was ruled by the whites. Their government was in Saint-Louis. Their governor summoned all 84 marabout, or Muslim learned men, Muslim clerics of Senegal. When they arrived, the governor wanted them to renounce their Muslim faith. He wanted them to sign an agreement to renounce their faith. 83 marabouts, clerics, signed. But when Bamba's turn came, he refused. He signaled the impurity of the meeting and ordered his follower Sheikh Ibra Fall to cleanse the room. After Fall had cleansed the room, Sheikh Amadou Bamba prayed 2 rakas. So a raka is one, how do you say that? One movement of the body that signals that's part of the Muslim prayer. And a normal prayer consists of 5 of these movements, but special prayers can consist of only 2 of them. This is of course Bamba, and that is of course Sheikh Ibra Fall, who cleanses the room with this what looks like a teapot, but it's one of those cans that Muslims in West Africa use to cleanse themselves. This prayer, as it is being prayed here, Tafa concluded, saved us. Had Bamba not said this prayer, he would still have lived under colonial rule and Islam would have been forbidden. Through his prayer of the 2 rakas, Bamba has saved Islam and our purity, unquote. The painting by Tafa Sek is exemplary for a genre of history paintings that documents the saint's life in images by representing the stations in the life of the saint. The painting is authorized by historical research, as all the names of the officials participating in the Privy Council are given in cartouches that appear above their heads, identifying each and every one of them, apart from the Senegalese interpreter. However, even though authorized by the archive, the painting is not inspired by it. In Tafa Sek's testimony of the trial, Bamba was one of 84 Muslim clerics summoned by the administration to be heard in the Privy Council. This testimony is not supported by the historical documents, according to which only Bamba was summoned to Saint-Louis. Tafa's allusion to the 84 clerics can only be understood as an attempt to magnify the stance taken by Bamba. This suggests that the painting appropriates the authority of the archive in order to support claims that go against it. A comparable act of documentation, inspired by submission to the saint rather than historical research, can be found in another painting by Tafa Sek that he offered for sale on the Saint-Louis pavement. In this painting, he has commemorated yet another station in the life of the saint, whilst sojourning under colonial tutelage in Saint Louis. According to this legend, when Bamba was held at the military training grounds in Saint Louis, the colonizers incarcerated him in the company of a hungry lion. Surprisingly, the lion refused to attack Bamba and peacefully reclined next to him. The story repeats a trope encountered in Sufi legends that recount how Sufi saints tame wild animals, legends that echo the story of the Old Testament prophet Daniel, who reportedly tamed a lion. Such legends are widely distributed across the Muslim world and convey that Sufi saints wield superior spiritual powers. Ruling over untamed nature, the saints are portrayed as being elevated above the trappings of the natural world. Through visual documents of this kind, the Murids insinuate that the saints' spiritual victory over the colonial administration by appropriating a Sufi repertoire of legends that span the Muslim world. Legends that have existed since time immemorial are incorporated in a Murid repertoire mobilized for the purpose of post-colonial memory work. The aura of local saints is enhanced through Muslim technologies of authentication that have circulated in the context of empire. More recently, Chinese producers have taken on the production of such visual art in a bid to compete with local artisans, effectively dislocating the local market with cheap plastic reproductions. As the reproduction of local legends is subjected to a neoliberal market, any suggestion that these legends should be considered more authentic than the colonial archive should be dismissed as a romanticizing of resistance. But it is important to establish that these representations are part of a visual hagiography that references the colonial archive, but is not supported by it. This visual hagiography surreptitiously appropriates the authority of the colonial archive to produce an alternative anti-colonial history. So these legends are actually being encountered by the pilgrims who come to Saint Louis in the places that they visit. So when pilgrims visit Saint Louis to reenact the saint's prayer, they remember that prayer as a critical act that led to national independence. Several places at which the saint is known to have sojourned during his trial are then made accessible to the public. Such sites are the train station, the cells in which he was incarcerated, the mosques where he prayed, and the military camp. And in 2011, when I visited Saint Louis, I was given a guided tour of some of these sites by Abdurrahman Wat, who is a member of the organizing committee and the son of the founder of this annual commemoration. So we visited some of these sites. This was one of them. When Bamba arrived by train in Saint Louis on the 12th of August 1895, he was immediately taken to a cell in one of those military barracks that I showed you in one of the first slides. The significance of this cell was recently established by Colonel Bai Job, a former customs officer, who claims that he discovered it. Job was the first person to sense Bamba's presence in this room and to dedicate a prayer to him. It's quite an interesting story how I got to meet this man, because I was initially guided to meet a Frenchman who actually lived in this particular room. And so I was received by this Frenchman, and He wasn't quite a Sufi Muslim, but he told me a story about how he had actually seen himself, how the saint Bamba had come through the wall into the room that we were standing in, which I found hard to believe, but I didn't, of course, question it. So that room, so the Frenchman then suggested to me I should go and see Job, who had a similar account of how he had, how he entered this room and sensed the presence of the saint. Since he was the first to dedicate a prayer to him in this room, he suggested that it was only after that prayer that the cell was recognized of the Murid patrimoine, as it is being referenced. During the annual commemoration of the saint's sojourn, pilgrims go to this room and to pray and meditate. This cell is one of several sites designated by the saint's disciples as a place of worship. Authorized by stories of miracles, the authenticity of these sites is established through testimonies of the saint's disciples. In contrast to the bureaucratic process that authorizes Saint Louis as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, this alternative archive of sites is authenticated through visions and legends. It is no coincidence, of course, that this alternative archive doubles the UNESCO archive, honoring not the grand facades of the colonial palaces, but the hot, oppressive cells in which the saint was detained. So this is a cell in the cell number 4 in the governor's palace where presumably the saint was detained after the trial. The alternative archive not only provides an inventory of the saint's stations, but by tracing the regime of incarceration that he was subjected to, remembers the colonial policy and exposes it to the public at large. Another site I visited. After 4 days in the military barrack, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba was transferred to a military camp on the mainland that is currently occupied by the National Institute of Agricultural Research. There he spent another stint incarcerated by the colonial army. I cannot state with certainty how many days he spent there, since oral sources contradict each other on this count, nor am I absolutely certain that the saint was incarcerated, as some of his disciples claim that the saint voluntarily went on retreat at this site in order to prepare himself for the confrontation with the colonizer. And this is a recurring theme in these legends, that the saint is actually not subjected or forced by the colonial authorities, but actually is the secret author of his actions. When visiting the site, I noticed how some parts of the training grounds had been carefully cleared and set apart by circles of white stones in which clean sand had been deposited. Sites where Bamba presumably had prayed in 1895 were thus set apart and made available for pilgrims to pray. Photographs of Bamba marked the direction of Mecca. I saw indeed some female pilgrims conducting prayers at this site. Interestingly, the canonization of the site and its formal inscription, if one could use these words, into Murid heritage is testified in this picture, which of course is a picture of the site, which was a photograph on view on the saint's legacy at the annual exhibition that is held in his honor when the commemoration is held. And there's a whole range of these photographs that the Brotherhood brings out in order to authorize these sites. Commemorating such miracles performed by the saint, it is not surprising that the organizing committee of the commemoration refers to this and other sites as the patrimoine mouride, or mouride heritage. Whilst the notion of patrimoine is usually associated with the city's status as a World Heritage Site, the Cultural Committee has appropriated it in an attempt to subvert the significance of the colonial heritage and insert a counter-memory into the colonial city. For the Mourides, heritage does not refer to the colonial architecture of balconied houses, of erstwhile privileged inhabitants, but to the cells and the military barracks where the saint was held, the sites where he prayed, and the miracles he performed. The historical architecture is not the trace of an epoch that Mourides want to restore historically. In contrast, the barracks in which the saint was detained now serve as sites to reenact his prayers. In the Mouride conception of patrimoine, what matters is Bamba's baraka, wolof for blessing, which gives presents to the saint. Alongside the sites of Mouride heritage, many murals, of course, of the saint on house fronts in Saint-Louis constitute a post-colonial archive of testimonies to the disciples' devotion. Although they refer to these sites of memory as patrimoine, the Mourides do not preserve the places of prayer in their original form. In the last decades, many of the sites at which Bamba is known to have prayed have been consecrated through the construction of a mosque. At the National Institute for Agricultural Research, such a transformation of the site had not yet been accomplished, and speakers at the conference regretted this. But throughout Senegal, many places have been transformed into mosques by a Mouride movement to archive these sacred sites. The monumentalization of Bamba's traces is conceived as the conservation of the Mouride heritage. The effacing of the original site of prayer by the installation of a mosque signals an alternative conception of heritage than that which informs the UNESCO plan of the city's conservation. Archived as sites sacred to the saint's memory, these sites are counter-monuments, in particular to the monument of General Ferdinand at the square Ferdinand, a monument that many of Bamba's disciples have repeatedly tried to topple. Yeah. So I'm here opposing two forms of commemoration. The one that happens within the public sphere, endorsed by the City Council and UNESCO, and the kinds of commemorations that occur at sites that are part of the Sufi archive. Saint-Louis has archived its colonial cityscape and seeks to preserve it through the implementation of a conservation plan that restricts alterations to the architectural traces of colonialism. Utopian in its aspiration to halt Saint-Louis' ongoing degradation, Saint-Louis' listing on the UNESCO World Heritage List has on several occasions been endangered as its strategic vision for the city is subverted by the spatial tactics of its inhabitants. Openly ignored by some of its most prominent inhabitants, the utopian vision for the city's restoration reveals that the strategic archiving fails to address the ambitions of the city's population. In a parallel act of patrimonialization, the disciples of the Mouridia have preserved spaces that the UNESCO archive does not recognize as worthy of preservation. In their attempt to record the saint's resistance against the colonizers, his disciples have traced the various places where the saint sojourned in Saint-Louis. Through the legends told about his miracles and their curation of the sites of prayer, the Murid's disciples give presents to Bamba. The Murids have appropriated the discourse on patrimonialization in order to legitimize their tactics to preserve the traces of their saint. In an interesting article on the stakes of the colonial heritage in Africa, Sinou has argued that the colonial heritage represents an ambiguous legacy that post-colonial subjects do not identify with. Although he is certainly right to argue that the colonial heritage engenders feelings of ambivalence resulting in neglect, his definition of what constitutes care is perhaps too narrowly conceptualized as conservation. I want to suggest that Murids care for the sites associated with Bamba, and although their care does not result in the conservation of the colonial heritage, it certainly amounts to its appropriation. Through devotion to the saint, the sites associated with colonialism are charged with affect. So, to conclude, as a geography, the city of Saint Louis and its archiving projects generate contrasting affects. The conservation of Saint Louis' colonial cityscape aims at the return of, quote, the splendor of times gone by, unquote. Directed towards the tastes of visiting French tourists, the conservation policy of the city's colonial heritage generates an affect of colonial nostalgia. In contrast, the effect generated by Bamba's traces is one of religious devotion. Cast as either return or reassertion, the narratives on the archiving projects of the colonial city share a preoccupation with temporal return, but serve the production of different futures.